sodium yellow light marked out the shape of the window in the negative on the ancient woolen rug in the center of number 13's living room. James Potter stared out into the street, past the street lamp and, to, the iron railing that bordered the little park at the center of Grimmauld Place's housing square. Looking back at the lists in his hands again, he resumed his pacing across the rug, thinking through the organization of the evening. An hour ago, Mick Mullen, he'd sent him down to Deveran, in Cornwall, to investigate a disturbance by the coast. Could be conjurists. Could be anti-conjurists. Could be kids. He sighed, rubbing his temples with his thumb and second finger and screwing up his eyes in an effort to relieve the strain. Could be anyone. He looked at the list again. Everyone allocated. He'd even sent Mrs. Figg to watch the passing in Whitby. Unlikely to be anything nefarious. But in James's experience, his onerous experience as it was beginning to be, no tip-offs were to be ignored, not since the last meeting of the reciprocators, where a report had gone unattended and 3 non-wizards were caught up in unpleasantness just outside Oldham, and dash. A sudden bang from the vicinity of the staircase caused James to look up sharply. Mick's twin Dave had volunteered to remain with James as all of the rest of the reciprocators were fully employed. Currently he was busy reinforcing the stairs and the cellar. Apparently the weight of paperwork that Aberforth had created, and the reciprocators had continued to add to, had a compounded structural problem from which the whole terrace of houses in Grimmauld Place had been suffering. While the non-wizard residents had taken to expensive repairs, talking loudly with one another in the street about the problem and the cost, the reciprocators had come and gone wordlessly, knowing precisely the cause was their data storage problem. "It just needs a bit of compression," James had heard Dave say as he trod carefully down the worn stair carpet and towards the ever-growing pile of twits, Transwizard immediate transmissions. And compression he had given it. The parchments on which the reciprocators had stored their work since the beginning of the following was indeed overflowing from their storage space under the stairs, and he had lingered for a few moments as the younger Mullen twin began in his efforts to reduce their volume. Howls of protest leapt from the parchments and papers, especially the older ones which had become somewhat sentient, criticizing Dave. They remembered when he was tiny and wondered what his parents would think. That I'm willful and rebellious, just like Mick. Dave had guffawed as he tried another spell. James smiled to himself as a pop and fizz that had echoed around the ground floor like an oral poltergeist reminded him of that earlier conversation. He folded at wits. Nothing more could be done that evening. He was trying his best too. His friends and colleagues were telling him he was doing brilliantly. Perhaps he was, James had thought. He just couldn't see it himself. He was just hanging on, hoping that tonight's Snape, or possibly Cleus, would be there, relieving him of the burden of leadership. He shook his head as he sloped towards the kitchen, dodging a blue flash that was Dave having a word with the early 20th century documents who were quoting Rabbi Burns's to a mouse. "I'll give you cowering timorous beastie." James grinned as he pushed open the kitchen door, just in time to avoid a singeing from another blast of blue as Dave tried, Presium Presiama, a spell that the ministry used for their information archiving. Pressing down onto a chair, James lowered his head, his unasked-for position, leaden, unrelenting, bearing down. He closed his eyes. The reciprocators were not what they had once been. All of them were overworked, waiting as the nights passed, as they contained and diffused conflicts between wizards, conjurists, anti-conjurists, non-wizards. They had not seen either of their joint leaders for nearly a month and, not for the first time, James wondered whether it was now up to him, too, to fulfill this too, pro tem. For both heads of the reciprocators their absence was entirely understandable. For Snape's part, the student illnesses, for Cleus the ever-growing incidences and ferocity of conjurist attacks around the country. But where did that leave them? James had taken to abandoning any plans that had been put in place at the start of September between the three of them and instead taken it upon himself to start again. taking into account any happenings of the day. He had reorganized the shift timetables, given briefings, taken reports and filled them, the rhythmic cracking that continued under the stairs attesting to James's meticulousness in that respect, and what he had promised to do for the reciprocators, that is, to be its temporary head for a fortnight, had become a month long of unrelenting pressure. It wasn't even midnight and Tunks had already returned to headquarters, exhausted and famished. She left shortly after eating 2 bacon sandwiches, one after the other, to her third call out of the night, and her departure had been shortly followed by the Weasley twins' return, then Wize Chapter, all of them suffering from the effects of prolonged, extended shifts. They had all agreed to do this, James reminded himself, and happy to do so. They had agreed to timetable Sirius's time, and to take on additional work. It was a stopgap, Severus had explained, to support to the errors in the ministry as Cleus enacted the ministry's plans to contain this growing, unprecedented, domestic unrest. The Mullins, he knew, had not been privy to a meeting. Both twins expressed their concern at the reciprocators' prolonged emergency role in their dry, acerbic manner. James opened his eyes again and looked about Grimwald Place's kitchen, taking in the time from the cuckoo clock 1/4 to midnight. Time soon for him to be out, taking one of Lily's shifts. Haverford West, in South Wales, had been experiencing some disturbances of late and he had rotated it into their shifts. Lily would be there shortly after 2, having spent the evening trawling through documents for the ministry and complaining of headaches. Sam was on her mind, he knew, his application for European Ministry scholarship. But, too, Lily had not been the same since the news about Henrietta. None of them had. What they really needed was a meeting to talk about the immediacy of things going on, how long their intense involvement would last. Just, even, for a morale boost, Merlin knew he could do with that. But equally, who was he to question both Severus and Cleus? Both had more than he to manage. As the Sparks and Burns poetry continued below, James made his way upstairs. Sirius was awake, he knew, the candles burning in the library where his friend taken up residence since his recovery, who moved books from his bed as he spied James in the doorway. Just seeing Sirius Black's face, alert and with its characteristic mischief and mirth, was a kind of comfort to him, rather than the impassive, unconscious state in which he had seen him at St. Mungo's. "How are you?" James pushed open the door of the second-floor bedroom. The light, glowing from the candle brackets, glimmered on the cerulean blue wallpaper in Sirius's bedroom where his friend was recuperating. It seemed like only yesterday they had been boys, lighting candles in the same holders, Grilham's underage, visible to those under 17, perfect for staying up so late into the night that it became early. His friend, lying propped up on the pillows and leafing through an outdated prophet, raised his head and frowned. "Well, who are you?" Sirius put down his newspaper, leaned forward. His newly acquired spectacles, a concession to injury, rather than the ravages of age, or so Mr. Black Jr. would have you believe, and narrowed his eyes. James sighed inwardly. They'd been warned about possible after-effects of his ordeal. "Sirius, it's me." "James." It had been 3 weeks since Sirius had left the hospital. He hasn't seemed to have had any problems since he'd been home. James insisted. "Your friend?" But now, amnesia clearly had taken hold, as incomprehension passed several times over Sirius's features. And then suddenly, his friend threw back his head, laughing loudly, his mirth interspersed with a breathy coughing. James grinned, his earlier weariness evaporating as he sat at the end of Sirius's bed. "Sorry I haven't been up in a few days," he continued as Sirius's chuckling ebbed away. "We seem to have been up against it, recently. The cat I've seen. Creature I've seen. Hell, James, even Mrs. Figg made her way up to tell me about her water lilies." "Water lilies? In October?" "She lives in a flat. She hasn't even got a pond. James sighed, smiling at his friend's apparent umbrage. Imagine how we felt, you inconveniencing us, malingering in hospital. Never mind the endless paperwork from Cleus. He noticed Sirius shift uncomfortably, anything to skive off and leave us to do all the hard work. Sirius smiled at his friend's ribbing. How's the other malingerer? I take it there's been no change for Remus? Afraid not. James shook his head. Still sleeping. And it used to just feel like a bit of a lark, something to do in our spare time, Sirius mused, wincing again as he shuffled up the bed. Some hobby. I take it Lily told you about Henrietta? James glanced down at the article at the bottom of the page, an article now smaller in size and relegated to the corner, the news being now nearly a fortnight old. And Sam? She said he'd be taking an internship. To the European Ministry, nodded James. Not just any old government job for our little Sammy. Ha ha. Sammy. I still remember him throwing up all over this very bed when he was a little one. I fully expect you to remind him of it when he becomes the European president. And his inaugural speech would be favorite. What does he have to do to pass? The usual. He's done the initial exams and thanks to Hermione he spent a month working in Strasbourg. Just his NEWTs, final scholarship exam and voluntary public service to complete. Voluntary. But it's required to be completed for his application? Sirius grinned, stifling a cough and reaching for his medication. I know. I didn't point it out. I don't know who's more nervous, Sam or Lily. But I rather think her current state of mind is to do with Hen. She's spending a good deal of time with Petunia recently, so I know she's cut up. We all are. She's thinking of taking up the vacant teaching post now Binns has finally taken his leave. To the library, James clarified. He can't really leave. But he'd been taking longer and longer to get to lessons to teach the students. One day, they all waited for him, packed in tightly, and he taught all of them at once. Not really good enough, especially with the non-wizard students. And Cleus's requirements for challenging outcomes for each student. Not one of them has been adequately taught unless they all exceed expectations, the non-wizards especially. One could almost suspect a hidden agenda, Sirius commented. But of course, Cleus Lupin would never do that. Severus has more things to think about than just Cleus's political meddling. James's expression was grim. Draco Malfoy, and I can understand his principles, has imposed an educational openness between the three main educational establishments in Europe. What? Hedgewood's, Durmstrang's and Puxperton's teachers are required to collaborate and share research material with one another. Cleus is dead against it. We don't know about Severus. But it seems to be almost wholly unpopular. Durmstrang's teachers have been sending owlers to Strasbourg to strongly protest the imposition. Owlers? Their invention. Like howlers, but formal protests that scream their indignations to the president himself whenever they arrive. And they've been arriving to scream at Draco Malfoy day and night since the diktat was imposed. Sirius chuckled. What's Cecilia got to say about it all? I take it she's moral studies teacher again? If she is, it's not at Hedgewood's, said James, wryly. Eh? I thought she was on Cleus's good side, and she was coming back from Durmstrang. She did. But without Cleus's permission. She walked, can you believe it, halfway across the country to get back to Helvellyn. But he sent her back to Durmstrang. Harsh. But I can see his point. Better to have someone on the inside with all the collaborating it has to do. James was about to say that he'd never thought of it like that when his friend then asked about their other colleague. No one's heard about Tabitha, James shook his head. Or if Cleus had, he's keeping it under wraps. There's no one like Cleus for intrigue and good old-fashioned dirty politics. He smiled, coughed, then cursed Merlin as he scrabbled around for a chest-relieving pill. It was good to have him back, awake, someone to talk to. Sirius would never have forgiven himself for not pulling through, however weak he was at the moment. James was glad to have his friend back in one piece, more or less. "It's going to get better," Sirius conceded. "I can nearly walk." "Well, I put my feet on the floor yesterday." "That explains the loud crash we heard," James nodded, "as you fell over." "What's happening, James?" Sirius leaned forward and gripped his forearm, staring at him intently. "I thought we knew our world, I thought we knew our work. To turn up to a house to get them to keep the noise down and for unlicensed half-breeds to attack us." Sirius shook his head. "Makes me realize every day how hard we work, and why we do it. Can you imagine deregulation, as some are proposing?" James shook his head. "Then there's the bandwagon ones, who just want to create a disturbance. And it's hardly surprising non-wizards are getting tetchy. I mean, with little chance to defend themselves from nefarious attacks, worry for the safety of their children. What have Cleus and Severus got to say about things? You can't go on like this. You can't all be working like this forever. Merlin knows I want to be there with you," he growled, looking away. "And you will, old man, you will. You've just got to get over the last time you helped." "But, we've not heard from either of them for nearly a fortnight. The political situation, Cleus. And then there's the Hedgewood situation." "Hedgewood situation?" Sirius looked confused. James began to continue the jest, but this time he realized his friend might really not know. "With the students? The non-wizards?" Sirius continued with uncomprehension. "The non-wizards. You remember Cleus believes in the inclusion of a cross-section of the country into Hedgewoods. The government, at any rate, which is basically Cleus," James clarified. Sirius nodded. "Some started to get ill, as usually happens at the start of term. Some wizard children came down with illnesses too, so Madame Pomfrey didn't think anything of it. But now practically every non-wizard child at the school is in the infirmary, suffering from one illness or another, fatigue, headaches, vomiting. Nothing specific. Poppy's doing her best. She's imposed a magical quarantine where the students are recuperating. Some have seemed to be getting better, and when they've returned to lessons, within a few days they're back." "What's Severus's view? And Cleus? A failed experiment? He's going to send them home, surely?" Sirius shook his head. "Poor kids. Severus thinks they should go home, I believe." James shook his head. "But clearly it's far more complicated than that. Which is why both haven't been here, with organizing us." "Yes, Lil said you'd taken it all on." "They have more than enough to deal with," James conceded. "And I've done a few things to make things easier for us all. Joined head of the reciprocators go hang." "Such as?" "Sorted the shifts. Tunks took on a triple last week. Our range is getting further, so Mick and Dave have taken on 3 extra in the week too. Oh, and I've scheduled a meeting for tomorrow so that both Severus and Cleus can come. We need to be more efficient, in our ever so interesting times." "Listen, I can help." Sirius suddenly interjected before his friend had a chance to rebuff him, the weight of years melting away as the youthful boy leaned forward, telling his friend about a nefarious scheme in which they could all make their ends. "I can. Tell me I can help." "Yes," James nodded at length, smiling at Sirius's boyish enthusiasm. "You can help. Are you able to get downstairs?" "Yes." "No. I don't think so. But my magical abilities are unaffected." "What do you need?" "You. Just you. Here. Downstairs. To be you. You are a symbol of what we're doing, day in, day out. You just can't imagine what it's been like for us, since before you were both attacked. The rise of the Conjurists, stupid wizard kids who we have to pass over to the others on a daily basis. And Bathsheba just this evening has uncovered some evidence that there has been some counter-defense amongst non-wizards. We just need inspiration, that's all. Then, you'd better hold on to the bedpost. What? He watched as Sirius leaned forward, the copy of the day before's Daily Prophet fluttering to the carpet as he withdrew his wand from beneath the sheets. Now. James didn't need telling twice. Hugging the oak column with full might, he watched as the scenery of the room trembled with bone-shuddering vibrations. It took him a moment to realize what was going on, but, as the scenery of Sirius's bedroom slowly blurred, audacity of the spell which his friend had undertaken quickly became apparent. He'd operated them both, and half a ton of oak in the form of a 4-poster bed, 10 feet downwards into Grimwald Place's living room. Dave Mullen, wiping his hands much as a mechanic who just changed the oil and spark plugs on your car might before charging you £200 for the privilege, ducked out from the cupboard under the stairs with an air of satisfaction at a job well done. All sorted, James. They won't be bothering us, Ag. His eyes widened as he broke off, at the sight of a huge bed. Sirius and James holding on for dear life crystallized into view before his eyes. Before he had a chance to say anything, dryly or otherwise, however, the kitchen door burst open. Tunks, a sheaf of paper in her hands and a frantic look on her face, shouted for their temporary leader. James. She looked at the bed, ignoring its obvious discrepancy of being in the living room, and pulled him up by the hand. Tunks, wait. Come on, James. Look. She thrust a pamphlet into his hand. James wove his way unsteadily towards the settee, rubbing his head and staring at it, turning it over and then back. Where did you get this? I went to a disturbance down in West Wales. A tiny place called Angle. Some kids were trying to put a spell on them. I tried to catch them, but they ran off. They seemed to be with some non-wizard kids. What's it say? It's the same that has been put out by conjurists recently, urging action into converting Britain back into a magical land once more. Same as the other ones the Weasleys recovered tonight. What? They've not been back. Tunks looked frantic. You don't know, do you? From wildly leaping about as she told her story, Tunks sank into the seat next to James. What? Tunks? What don't we know? Dave Mullen's voice rang clear and seemed to cut through the witch's panic. The Weasleys, all of them, went out on their duties tonight. Bathsheba too, Benjamin. Even Arabella Figg. All of them found at the scenes of their disturbances the same pamphlet. It seems to be inciting violence. Like the ones we've found most nights for months, James said grimly. Yes, but yes, you don't understand, do you? These are all the same. Identical. And each scene they were discovered it was on fire. Burning. The buildings were burning. The land was burning. A coordinated attack. James inched forward. So far, from what they'd been able to tell, incidences had been few and far between, sporadic, unrelated. But now. It's what we've been debating at the ministry. Dave shook his head, sharing ministry information, unusually for him as he kept the two spheres of duty separate with cool, professional ease. It is believed that someone is coordinating the wizards who are carrying this out. A leader. Someone with charismatic influence. Before anyone had a chance to say anything more on the matter, however, the kitchen door swung on its hinges as an operating wizard arrived violently in the kitchen. Arthur Weasley strode hurriedly through and into the living room. You're right, Tunks. They're identical. And I went to another call. He thrust a piece of folded paper in her direction. Nymphadora Tunks immediately handed it to James. Where did you find this? He looked at the bedraggled, scorched Mr. Weasley before him. Where? Tell me, Arthur. I checked. Lily is still at Petunia's, he began. Where? James insisted. Godric's Hollow. The whole village was alight. James, I'm sorry. Your house was one of them. 88,888,888. Septimus couldn't sleep. The outline of the trees formed shadows against the lead-checked windows and, at 3 in the morning, he was growing bored of seeing them. Most nights he would wake up, unable to fall asleep. Some, it had to be said, were the noises from below, in the common room, older students busying themselves with amusements, Quidditch talk, portable pensives applications, talking, chatting and laughing about so many things. And on the rare occasion, studying. Others, Septimus preferred not to think about. At times when his mind drifted to his mother, he could not lie there and tried to think. Instead, he wondered about what she was doing, what she might be occupied with so far away on a minuscule island off the west coast of Norway, what she might be doing. It then drifted to his father. Still no change was the message he regularly received. Sometimes it comforted him, but mostly not. On nights when his parents crossed his mind, Septimus chose to sneak out and be away from the school, Doriel keeping him company and, high above, with the vengeful wind tearing through the air, the chipping and hooting of restless, sleepy and victorious owls, the latter returning with their prey, drowning out the melancholy in his heart. On several occasions he kept his silence in the company of Rufus Lestrange, whose odd presence and arbitrary topics of conversation proved surprisingly consoling. Frequently it was because he knew his friend wasn't there in the dormitory but instead, lying ill in the infirmary. Julian wasn't far away and, it was true, that he couldn't actually make him better. But as Rufus said, medicine isn't always a potion. Of course Septimus shouldn't get up tonight. Tomorrow he had a test, level 1 charms. He never did very well with his wand work when he was tired. It had only been a couple of nights ago when he'd fought tiredness long enough to tackle the Occlumency homework because the night before he'd gone to sit with Doriel. But the thought of Julian being ill, being shut away for so long, so bored, so lonely, made him alert. He'd stay with his friend all night if he had to. No. He mustn't. What trouble would he be in if he was caught? He'd be grounded at the castle. Callias would find out. No one would trust him again. Professor Snape might not take him to see his dad. Septimus turned over and closed his eyes. And then opened them again. Of course he was going to get up to see him. And of course, he knew he was breaking the rules. Why were all these children ill? It was a question that Septimus had asked himself several times since Julian had been sent to Madame Pomfrey's care. He wasn't the only one, and a question he was increasingly concerned about. What if he never got better? And what was causing him, and the other students to be ill? According to Daron, there hadn't been any kind of illnesses at Hedgewoods for years, not since the Black Death in the 14th century. But that was so long ago it didn't really count. It was a chilly frost was spreading across the windows and Septimus pulled on his dressing gown over yesterday's clothes before stealing down to the common room and through the passageway. And then, a noise behind him made him stop. Septimus knew he shouldn't leave the common room and perhaps he had done so too many times before. Maybe some of the teachers had noticed and were waiting to catch him. The chances were high. He had turned wandering around the castle at night into an almost commonplace activity. He turned slowly. Thought you'd go to Jules without me, did you? Daz. Septimus's exclamation echoed down the outer corridor. Shush. Someone will hear you. Darren hurried closer and strode past Septimus. Come on, else we'll be caught. As usual, the infirmary was dark, the outer door unlocked in case of emergencies. Pushing it ajar, Septimus wondered how many other students had crept through the interface between the school's realm and that of Madame Pomfrey, searching for friends and loved ones, worried for their health, impatient for their recuperation to be over. As usual, Julian Scott was asleep. In the long mirror opposite the bed they could see their friend's hunched figure, curled up, his body moving up and down as he slept. Septimus was just about to go around the corner and search for a couple of chairs for them both, so they could wait for their friend's awakening when Darren pulled him back. "Stop. Look." Next to the bed, knees tucked under encircled arms and hands clasping a book, the figure of a girl. In the dark light, Septimus could just about work out who it was. "What's she doing?" "Reading." "I can see that," hissed back Septimus. "But what? And why is Arella Blewett here at this time of night?" "Same reason as us, I suppose," replied Darren, indifferently. "Look, he'll be awake soon. We can have a chat to him. I've brought him the latest Quidditch magazine. I know you've got him something from Honeydukes." Septimus nodded. He peered back at Arella. But why was she here? She could read her book in the common room. At the sound of the boys approaching, Arella started, freezing momentarily, before scuttling to hide away the book, and wiping tears from her eyes before getting to her feet. "Arella. Wait." Septimus was about to ask her what she was doing, but the girl had taken to her heels and was away. Just then, there was a murmur from the bed. Darren found another chair and sat on it, ignoring Septimus's unspoken questions about the presence of the girl, and instead pulled the rolled-out magazine from out of his jacket. It took a few moments for Julian to get himself sitting upright, but when he had, he grinned at his friends. "McGonagall not grounded you yet, then?" "Not found us out," said Septimus, shrugging. "Besides, when do we get to see you? We're working all day and there's homework all night." Darren nodded. "And Quidditch, of course," Septimus added. "Always Quidditch." "I think they're going to send us home." Julian's voice was low and rough and he tried to hold back a cough. "I heard Snape talking to Madame Pomfrey. Too many students, non-wizard students, are ill. It's too much of a coincidence." Darren nodded. "Do you know that there was someone here before we got here?" Septimus nodded towards the door. "She ran off." "She?" Julian stretched, yawned and rubbed his eyes. "Oh, you mean Arella?" "Yes. Arella." Septimus sounded the words carefully. "She came to talk to me," she said. "Only she didn't say much. I think she was trying to apologize for what her brother called me." Darren and Septimus exchanged looks. "What did he call you, Jules?" Julian looked between them. "Miss Bourne." "You what?" Darren roared the word, and this time it was Septimus who shushed him into silence. "What?" Darren hissed fiercely. "How dare he send you threats?" "Don't do anything," Julian responded. "It'll only make things worse. Especially if we're going anyway." It was the second time Julian had mentioned this, and this time Septimus felt the weight of it. His heart tightened and he felt a pang of sadness. So much he had wanted his best friend to come with him to high school, and now, here he was, ill with something or other, and probably due to go back home in any case. It had just delayed him getting to a non-wizard school. Not for the first time Septimus had wondered whether he had been selfish. "Not to worry," said Julian, as if reading Septimus's mind. "If I can't come back, I've had a brilliant time here. Nothing like it in the world. So few non-wizards see inside this place, I bet. And anyway, we're not gone yet. I could be up and about tomorrow singing Alleluia." The look on his face, pale and pasty from prolonged illness, told Septimus he didn't really believe it could happen. "I'm just so tired of feeling like this, like I'll never be better," Julian added, a somber edge to his voice. "I just can't remember how being well feels." "It dead boring, without you in lessons with us," said Darren. "Without you, how are we ever going to survive, Rufus Lestrange?" Septimus grinned. How are we ever going to get through boring old history of magic? You could try this. Julian leaned over and tried to pick up a large volumed book in his hands, but, fumbling, it tumbled back onto the floor. Bugger. He shook his head. Art of the Wise, read Darren, picking it up. Art of the Wise? Dunno. It just sounded like a whole load of kids' stories, said Julian as Septimus craned his neck to see. In an engraved picture a girl sat, knees folded in on the floor next to a fire, in a pose not dissimilar to Arella. Above was the word, Grimelda. Grimelda? Julian shrugged. Arella left it. I think it was by accident. Some of the stories are interesting, though. The one about the carnivorous plants growing by the lakes that wafted when people came near, hypnotizing them to come closer before strangling and drowning them. Creepy. Art of the Wise? Septimus closed his eyes, imagining the story of Grimelda. It was just a kid's story in mysterious mythology, an allegory of some lesson to be learned. In Grimelda's case, make sure you wear tight-fitting shoes and buy a watch before going off to a ball in a pumpkin carriage. Just stories, said Julian. Not the most thrilling thing in here, but I'm just so bored. That's when I'm not coughing my guts up or too tired to keep my eyes open. Here you are, mate, said Septimus, quickly realizing he had some sweets in his pocket for Julian. I asked for your favorite. Mr. Honeyduke himself had to find the jar. I don't think he sells many non-wizard sweets. Rhubarb and custard. Julian's eyes lit up as he eyed the contents of the white paper bag. Thanks, mate. He slipped one into his mouth, coughed, leaned forward trying not to choke on the boiled sweet, before leaning back on his pillows and offering the packet to Septimus and Darren. Not if they do that to you, Jules, laughed Darren, before taking one anyway, and Septimus took one too. Then he frowned. What's on your arm? Septimus stared at Julian's forearm as his pajama sleeve pulled upwards. Julian glanced down at the capital C enclosed in a circle clearly emblazoned on his skin. Wow! A tattoo? Darren peered closer, before looking back at Julian, the conjurist's symbol clearly visible. No, it's just pen. Look. Julian withdrew his arm and spat on it, rubbing at one side, which immediately faded as he rubbed at it. But it's the conjurist's sign, Julian, said Septimus slowly. The ones who want to kill all the non-wizards. Is it? Julian frowned. Oh yes. Arella did say you should put a line through it. Ha. Julian grinned, then sank back, closing his eyes. Look, Septimus leaned forward towards his friend. You've got to tell your mum. Would you like me to write to her? I'll ask Uncle K if I can go back home too. Keep you company. I could dash. He broke off as he noticed a figure lingering in the shadows. Arella lingered a little longer but then approached. Septimus and Darren exchanged looks. Hi, croaked Julian, as he noticed her by the bed. Hi, echoed Septimus and Darren. Weird, thought Septimus. 1 minute she's waiting by his bedside, pairs off when she sees us then comes back. Look, I have to tell you something. Arella, her dark eyes large with urgency. Are you alone? Both boys nod. I've already told Julian, when I came to tell him sorry about Fraser. She glanced momentarily at Darren. Merlin knows I can't stand him, and I've got to tell someone. She dropped her voice. But I can trust you, right? You're Julian's friends? Yes, Arella, said Septimus softly. You can trust us. It's important you don't tell anyone. Not even your uncle, said Arella, her eyes still insistent. Septimus nodded. I don't know what, Fraser and Dad are too careful to let me in on it. But I heard them talking by PP. What about? I don't know for sure. But it's big. Big, and it'll happen at Halloween. Their dad's almost for certain a conjurist. Julian filled in the gap. And Fraser too, said Arella. Wow. Septimus and Darren looked at one another again. That figured. But why, thought Septimus to himself, was Arella telling them? Mum is trying to do something. Your mum? Darren frowned, confused. But your brother, your dad. Yes, I know. Arella sank to the chair next to Julian's bed. Their friend looked at her sympathetically. That's why Fraser's been ordered to keep his eye on me. He pushed you over the edge at the Quidditch match. Darren added narrative to the image in Septimus's mind. No. It was a busy arena. I was trying to get across to Devon, her mum's in the ministry, to see if she would help us. Fraser got too close, though. If ever Dad finds out what Mum's trying to do. Arella shook her head, looking at her knees. Dad's a conjurist. He believes that the magical should be magical alone, and separate from non-magical. He hates your uncle, Septimus, she added, looking across at him. And there it was. A rebel in the family. He looked at the tiny framed girl, and for the first time Septimus realized how much he'd never guessed about her. How clever she had to hide it all behind a meek and quivering demeanor, making out she was a little mouse, a victim. But they're married? Your mum and dad? Arella nodded. They seem so happy together. It's as if they keep this one difference between them away from everyone at home. Mum believes we should all live happily together, despite the differences. Wow, said Darren, for the second time that night, and then he turned to Septimus. Hey, it's a bit like, you know, my brother and your sister going out, said Darren, referring to Dudley and Freya. Septimus nodded. An odd arrangement, his wild child adopted sibling and Darren's straight-laced older brother. They'd said as much in the past when they'd joked together, and Septimus now wondered whether they, him, his mum and Freya, even Dad when he got better, could find somewhere to live and take a leaf out of the Blue Witch's book. I wanted to see how many people would support her. Well, as actually support you? Arella and her mum have set up a group. Julian's voice was dry and throaty, as if his airway was blocking up and he was finding it difficult to talk. There's just you and her? Asked Septimus. Yes, but Mum thinks more people think like we do, and she wants to find them. Sounds like the best reason to be creeping around Hedgewoods at night, said Darren, archly. We're with you, said Julian quickly, a lightness passing over his features. We are? Said Septimus. Okay, good, said Arella, her face bright with enthusiasm. What I need is just to find out who I can talk to about it. See how many people want to join us. How many people have you asked? Asked Darren, apart from Julian, I mean. Arella smiled. 2. 88,888,888. What would you do for the internship? In the blackness deep beneath the school, one talked to another. Not for the first time these had met. What would you do? There was a long pause. Feet shuffled. A head shifted in the darkness. Anything. I'd do anything.